So in our last lesson, we added tessellation to the landscape, but let's go through now and add foliage. Now, there are a couple of different types of foliage within Unreal. They all use instance actors, but we can actually get the landscape to automatically place foliage for us depending on certain variables, which is a really, really useful little thing. So I'm going to open up my content browser, I'm going to right click, and now I'm going to go down, and what I'm going to be adding under miscellaneous is going to be landscape grass type. So click on that, and I'm just going to call this, auto-saved, I'm just going to call this landscape plains grass. And under here we have grass varieties, so I'm going to add one. And this, from here, lets me actually set it up such that anything that is in this section can automatically be applied to any landscape layer, or in any way that I've set out. So first off, we need to select a mesh. So I'm going to go to grass mesh, and I'm going to type in grass, and I'm going to search for the word plains, and I'm going to scroll down because the one that we want is SM plains underscore grass 01. And if I look at this mesh, it just looks like this. So I've added this, and I'm also going to get my grass density, and I'm going to go from 400 down to about, let's start with a value of 15. Now this is the number of instances per 10 square meters. So this can get out of hand quite quickly if you have a big number there. Now, I'm going to leave the other settings just as they are for a minute, and then I'm going to show you how they affect it once they're in the landscape itself. So we've got ourselves a landscape asset. I'm now going to go to my material, and I'm going to right click and type in grass. And you'll see that one of these says landscape grass output. Now why this is quite cool is any value that gets read into this is going to be determining where there is and isn't grass. So by clicking on this node, I'm going to say the grass type is the landscape plains grass that we just created. I'm then going to right click, and I'm going to say landscape. You see we have landscape layer blend, but we also have landscape layer sample. So add that one. Now a landscape layer sample means we can go ahead and we can get the current value of the grass, and I can say if the value is equal to 0, this is now going to have 0 grass. If the value is equal to 1, it's now going to have grass. By clicking apply and going back to my landscape, we now just wait just a second. And you'll notice that it's added all of these meshes. It's going to need to compile them first time, so give it just a moment. And you can now see that wherever we've added grass, it's gone ahead and actually placed meshes for us that are just sprawled out across the landscape. And this is really, really useful because if I go to my landscape painting now, and I click on paint, and paint a grass layer, watch what happens as I paint this in. So I can now actually paint in all of these 3D meshes that adhere to whatever it is that I've set up. And if I go back and I want to, I can actually then say, oh, let's lower the tool strength and remove a little bit of it so there's dirt patches in between. And when I come down here, you can see that those nice little patches kind of make it look substantially more realistic. So this is quite cool. One thing that I like to do here though, personally, is at the moment this is really heavily weighted so that it's more likely to have grass. If I go to my plains grass and I set my landscape, and I set the sample of the grass after it gets the value, which is a value between 0 and 1, if I get that value and I just add contrast to it, it's now going to have a little bit of green licking around the edges of the grass before it starts applying the meshes. So I'm going to hit apply. So you can now see there's a little bit of this green fading in, and the reason for that is by adding contrast, whenever the value is 1, it's still value of 1, but whenever it's 0.5, it's now 0.25. So this kind of gives us a slightly nicer blend in between the dirt and the grass itself. Now, if I open up this again, let's get this. I'm going to dock it on the right hand side so you can see the grass that's there. So if I change this, I can now start cutting back my density. If I set this to 5, 1, we can have obviously more or less grass. But it's a good idea for us to place cull distances to sort through this, because right now, if I zoom out, this grass takes quite a while before it starts to disappear. I actually personally like setting reasonably high density and then a pretty aggressive cull distance whenever my landscape isn't going to be viewed from a distance. So I'm going to set this to be between 1 and 5,000 is too high. Let's go actually it's between 1,000 and 10,000, and then as I move away, it's going to start culling away different bits of grass. So it'll get less and less dense, and then it'll pull them away. So 1 in 10,000 works reasonably well. The other thing that helps break this uniformity is, see where it says scale Z? I'm going to say I want every piece of grass to be a random scale between 0.8 and 1.2, which just makes every now and then it gets a little higher, a little smaller, and I personally feel it looks a lot better. Keep in mind you can crank these values up substantially if you really want to see some difference, but it's up to you. The scaling though is all set up here, so at the moment the uniform scale is X, Y, and Z. You can say free, which means the grass instances have random X, Y, and Z values. So I've applied that. Alternatively, there's also lock X and Y. So X and Y will be equal to one another, but Z will be on its own. And if I crank that up, you can now see that the Z is definitely randomly selecting. Also, I highly recommend not doing a value that high. But if I come back here, you see we have tall grass and short grass. So in this case though, I'm going to keep the values I had. 1.2 seems pretty good. And finally, to get this a little bit further, let's look at this. Let's duplicate it. And this time around, instead of adding grass, I'm going to change this mesh to say fern, and I'm just going to choose fern 1. I'm also going to drop the density. Now it's still called grass, so I'm going to drop the grass density of fern 1 to 0.1. And you can see that every now and then, it's just going to place a little fern around wherever my grass is. So we have smaller plants. So I can get this, and again, I can duplicate. And this time I can set this to fern 2. Duplicate. Fern 3. And you can see that we've got just a little bit more kind of breaking up the overall profile. So there's just random plants as I kind of move through the environment, which feels a lot nicer. So that's it. That's all it takes to get landscape grass. Next up, we're going to do painted foliage.